My name is Dario Hasenstab. I'm here with Balder Hagrid, and we are back with the Western Bubble podcast. Today, we're talking about the big, beautiful bill and the kind of larger dynamics that are at play here. Balder, but why specifically are we talking about this topic today?
Well, we've been talking about this topic for a long time, Dario, in the sense that it's been months, but since it was first introduced, there have been other events in the world that have drawn our attention. Now we're back because now it's actually passed the houses. Now it's actually basically finalized the political process. And so now there are two things to talk about. One, what are the consequences of this bill? The major legislative push by the Trump administration, and secondly, how is it possible that things like these get passed in supposedly well-functioning democracies? I think we all know that democracies are not as functional as they used to be, but this question of a clearly objectively bad bill, how is it possible that that gets passed through parliament? So plenty to talk about today.
Well, but let's start with what actually passed, right? What's potentially the problem with it, kind of why it is bad. Then we do want to look at what you just said. How is it that objectively bad things can get passed despite everyone knowing that they are bad? And then in the end, we'll talk about some personal responsibility we as voters could potentially take. But let's start with the bill. The big, beautiful bill, what a ridiculous name, right? Introduced by the Trump administration to the House and to the Senate. And because of how busy things have been in the past few months, I was actually surprised that this is already the third and final time that it has to pass one of the two chambers, right? Because I was still convinced that the Senate hadn't even talked about it. Because I remember that a few weeks ago it passed through the House and everyone got upset, but the kind of majority opinion was, hey, don't worry, this still has to go through the Senate and then it has to go through the House again. We don't need to worry yet. And then two wars and a few, big problems later, and suddenly this bill has gone through the House. And I completely missed the part when it went through the Senate and whether anything was changed and so on and so forth.
Yes, and the Senate is typically supposed to be the adults in the room, right? The senators are the ones who are supposed to look at it more calmly, less politically. It's the House of Representatives is often seen as more like the hen house where everyone is just fighting for their political spot and the limelight, where senators are supposed to be like the elderly, wise citizens who make sure that no craziness happens. But of course, the Senate has also been corrupted and politicized over the past few decades, and certainly, is no longer capable of properly fulfilling its basic duties. It did, I believe, send it back to the House with a few amendments, with a few changes, but nothing particularly big.
Well, one of the reasons why the senators are the adults in the room is because they simply have longer term limits, right? So for a senator, I think, is in the Senate for 6 years before they have to basically answer the voter again. In the House of Representatives, it's 2 years. Which means they're in a constant cycle of campaigning, of trying to get the most attention out there, trying to be the loudest in the room, to make sure that their voters back home think, oh, Marjorie Taylor Greene, she is really standing up for what I want and what I need.
And on top of that, there are only, maybe this is too basic for our listeners, but just for those few who don't know or haven't thought about this yet, there are only 2 senators per state, which means that your electorate, your constituency, is much less politicized because you're basically representing half of your states. Now, you're still going to be a Republican or Democrat. You're still going to have that political base, and Republican states will send out Republican senators. But if you compare it to congressmen who basically represent often very politicized districts that are just either incredibly blue or incredibly red, the political identity will change, right? As a senator, you feel more responsible for a much larger population with much more diverse perspectives, which changes your role.
One of the funniest things I've seen on the internet last week was a comment saying that there's I think that, what was it, like 1.4 million people in New York City take the tube, the metro every day. And that's twice as many as in Wyoming. So the New York Tube should have their own two senators, which is kind of another problem with this, right? Is I know that it's right. I mean, hey, don't worry, dear listeners. I did take the mandatory U.S. History and U.S. Like politics class during my exchange in the U.S. So I know state rights and everything. But it still must feel pretty shitty when you're from a state of California with 40 something million people living there versus Wyoming, where you have a few 100,000 people who obviously those senators carry more weight in their vote than maybe the one from California.
And it's one of those charming but also kind of awkward aspects of US politics, right? I mean, every country has some weirdness inherently in the system, but it is strange how, because of the decentralized system, the federal system within the United States, you're going to get a situation that you have certain populations coming from sparsely populated states being essentially much more powerful than a citizen from Los Angeles or New York or from Texas or anywhere else like that, where you have to share your vote with so many others. It's one of those quirks that I actually quite like about our world. It's a little bit similar to how in the United Nations, Luxembourg has one vote and the United States has one vote, right, in the General Assembly. There are reasons why it is like that, and I wouldn't propose changing it, but it does lead to these kinds of, rather strange systems that if you were a social planner, you would probably do it differently.
No, most likely. Let's talk about the bill itself. Somewhat controversial, with a stupid name, I'm going to say. We said at the beginning of this episode that this is objectively bad, right? Which is a claim that I don't think we make very often. Usually we're kind of saying that, hey, the world is complex, right? You have to analyze all these different factors that go into it. And let's not take any shortcuts in our thinking. With this one, it is so evidently, so obviously a bad piece of policy that I think, we didn't skip that process in reaching our conclusion, but it is so bad that the two of us are saying something is objectively bad. And I think for us to say that, it has to be really, really bad.
Indeed, and it's almost a shame that this comes from the Trump administration, because it seems like too knee-jerky. Then, of course they hate Trump, therefore they're gonna hate everything he passes. But there is just nothing really redeeming about this bill. This is the thing that people will often find difficult to understand. Even if you look at it from the top 1% or 10% of the US population, right? Who are supposedly winning in this bill, who are supposedly benefiting from this bill, particularly tax cuts and all that kind of thing. We've talked about this before. The United States is at a point that there is an objectively obvious analysis that goes something like this. The right level of taxation, the right level of government interference in our lives is subjective. It's tricky to understand, to know exactly what income tax should be, what inheritance tax should be, all those taxes should be. It's difficult to know how much a government should regulate or not. But the United States has gone way past a certain point. The United States is no longer in a gray area. They have gone way past the point where the rich benefit way too much from the system compared to the rest of society. And at some point, that's going to bite them in the backside. And that is where we're going now, right? With these kinds of bills passing, with the system increasingly supporting those who are already privileged economically, politically within the system, at some point, this is going to collapse US society, and it's going to collapse it for them as well. It's not just bad news for the poor, it's also very bad news for the rich, who are actually endangering the futures of their children and their grandchildren.
It's funny that you say at some point, because I would claim that this point was in 2016, when Donald Trump was elected for the first time, because the system didn't work for the people who felt left behind. I assume, right, because you used the word collapse, that you're talking about more extreme events.
Pitchforks.
Right? I mean, hey, it's I could see a situation in which, well, I could see. I am seeing a situation in which this is already happening, not with the pitchforks, but with a U.S. society which is so skeptical of anything like social democratic European, but that's no longer the case. I mean, I don't know if you've been following the what I call the preliminaries
The primaries?
the primaries. Thank you, of the race for the mayor in New York City.
Yes, that was fascinating.
Where the kind of the main guy, right, the establishment Democrat lost in favor of basically a what Americans would call a socialist. I think in Europe we would call him a normal social democratic guy, one. And even people on the right start finding this guy or the policies not so bad, right? Where they kind of start agreeing with some of these things, saying that well, maybe there is some truth to it.
Yeah, this is the shoehorn theory, right? Which is partially true. There are also some issues with it, but the idea that if you think about the shape of
the horseshoe.
Shoehorn. What did I say? Horseshoe. Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Dario. Horseshoe. What is a shoehorn? Is a shoehorn anything? No.
No, I thought it was some Dutch word that got translated to English.
No, a horseshoe theory where basically the two populist sides from the left and the right come together again or move closer together because they actually have these common problems that they are facing and that they're trying to solve in some ways. It's also important to realize that in New York, the Democratic primaries are essentially the elections. Maybe will be proven wrong now, but typically New York is not going to vote for a Republican and not going to vote for an independent. The Democratic Party has a firm hold over the city and the state as well. So basically this was the election for next mayor, and it was so obviously, so blatantly a election between the most and in many ways the worst kind of establishment person that you could think of, namely someone who's been there since forever, who comes from a privileged family with a brother and father having a long track record of being major players in New York. And on top of that, having big money behind him to keep him in power because that was in the interest of corporate and other interests. Then you've got a relatively unknown, very young, in his 30s, if I'm correct, somewhere in his 30s, candidate who says all kinds of things that the establishment doesn't want to hear about Palestine and all that, and who even uses the S words, the socialism words, to basically draw voters in, and it works. And this is what we've been seeing with Bernie Sanders as well, to a certain extent, right? In some ways, it's similar to Hillary Clinton versus Sanders in 2016 during the primaries of the Democratic Party. Then Hillary won those, of course, with disastrous consequences for the Democratic Party. These are mild signs of things to come, right? And at some point this is going to escalate, especially if the establishment continues to basically win these fights, right? In some ways, it's really good for the establishment what happened in New York, because at least it gives people a outlet. It gives them a sense that they still matter. If Cuomo had won in New York, that would have been just one other nail in the coffin of the system, because at some point people feel helpless. They feel that they can no longer make their voices heard, and they will then turn to more radical measures. And then the future will become a fight between the people wanting to rise up and the power of the establishment, maybe AI driven, who knows, to keep the people down. And it's going to be a matter of who wins that fight, right? But either way, it's going to be chaos, as in a revolution, pitchforks and that, or it's going to be some kind of deeply dark oligarchic dystopian future for us. Either way, it's not going to be good news.
Yeah, because the two of us have always said that a revolution is not a good thing.
Revolution is terrible.
It usually, like, people suffer. It usually gets a lot worse. and then in most cases, actually more authoritarian more authoritarian figures kind of emerge. And this bill, so the Big Beautiful Bill, is I think setting up the United States on a good path towards this either oligarchy with extreme control, authoritarian style, or revolution with whatever comes afterwards. One of the aspects that also kind of struck me as surprising and kind of tells you how confident Trump must have been in his first term is that this will be an extension of the 2017 tax cuts that Donald Trump gave out, right? Which also benefited the rich mostly, and the part that struck me was that they are running out now. I was like, why would they run out at the beginning of 2025? That's such an arbitrary number. No, it wasn't, because I assume that Trump and his cronies were convinced that Trump would be a two-term president. Well, they were right, but not two consecutive terms, right? Because I mean, after let's assume that Trump would have won the last term. Let's say another president would take over, and they would have to deal with kind of extending these tax cuts, right? Or not extending these tax cuts, and therefore being hugely unpopular because nobody likes more taxes. And that's something that they're also doing in this bill, right? So it's kind of thinking into the future. Who can we blame the fallout on? Because they know that this is a bad bill. Because a lot of these bad changes that they're introducing here are only coming into effect after the next midterms. So after, assuming that the Democrats will win, so after kind of someone else has to clean up the mess.
Indeed, it's a classic in that sense, but also it says something about voters and our system, especially in the United States, right? The same can be seen in Europe and elsewhere, but in the United States it's particularly strong. This kind of sense that lower taxes is always better. That voters will never vote for you if you say, I'm going to raise taxes. Whereas just conceptually, logically speaking, if we agree that there is a optimum level of taxation, no serious person believes that taxation should be zero, unless you're the most hardcore libertarian / sovereign citizen kind of nutter. Unless you're that, everyone would agree that there's somewhere an optimal level of taxation because we have to pay for basic social infrastructure. With which I mean roads, police, fire services, hospitals. Well, in the United States, that can be privatized, but those kinds of things. It's obvious that there needs to be some kind of government revenue, and that means that there needs to be a certain optimal level of taxation, which, by the way, on a side note, because that was big with all the tariff thing, you could never do through tariffs, right? Some Republicans argue that tariffs could replace income taxes. It won't. All right, so regardless of where you put that optimal level, whether it's 10% or 20% or 30% or 50%, or as in the United States in the 1950s, the top income rate in the 93%, if I'm correct, a top income tax. I mean, that's a bit much, but it was there. Wherever you put the number, there is a situation where taxes are too low. If you say income taxes should only be a flat 20%, which would be significantly lower than most countries have it. Okay, fine. But once they reach 15%, then you as a tax-paying voter should say, actually, I want my politicians to raise taxes, right? This idea that lower taxes are always good is so insane and so detrimental to good governance. And that is what we're seeing here, right? The politicians think that they can get away with it, being this irresponsible one who then puts the problems, the weight on the shoulders of future political generations, just because voters find it appealing when they say, I'm going to lower your taxes. It shows how voters are so often wrong and bad in their decision-making process.
Well, they're many times just stupid, right? Because if you poll them, most voters will say, yes, I want low taxes and I want high government spending. to kind of make sure that infrastructure is doing well, that schools are doing well.
This is exactly why we should be so concerned about too much voter participation in the political process, right? I mean, it's great to vote. It's great to be able to throw politicians out of office if they're corrupt. It's great to vote for new ones once in a while. All of that is good. But if you look at, for example, the California experiment 15 years ago or 17, 18 years ago, where basically they gave voters the chance to basically introduce legislation, and then if it got enough signatures and enough support, it had to be voted in by the California legislation. It led to exactly that. It led to basically enormous expenditure on schools and on healthcare, but also an almost bankrupt state. Because that's what you get, because voters think, I want lower taxes and better schools. Well, choose one. You can't have both.
And it's almost similar with this bill. So there was a great, so in the research for this episode, there was a great kind of graphic I saw by the BBC, which kind of showed, this is how much this bill is going to cost the United States over the next 10 years, and this is how much it will save the United States. Because Republicans are traditionally are very concerned with the deficit, and it's nice and cute to see, right? Because so the tax cut extensions will likely cost the United States $4.5 trillion US. There will be increases in defense spending and increases in border security spending. So ICE, right? Remember the bad guys? So they will each, defense will receive roughly 150 billion, borders will receive 129 billion. But then, of course, you need to save that money somewhere, right? And so they're taking it away from Medicare, green energy subsidies, and food benefits. This is when we say this is objectively bad. Like, if I cannot even comprehend how this has become policy, because we're talking about some of the most basic things, right? Even if you don't like the environment, okay, screw the subsidies for energy, right? They could be set up in a way of, I don't know, incentivizing something bad. But food stamps and hospitals, I feel like those are the things that usually people can agree on are good. But no, those are the things that will cut money, and then more defense spending, particularly more AI spending. Boulder, you're gonna love it, right? Deregulating AI. Those are the things that they keep in. I mean, it's insane.
Yeah, and I would even go as far as to say that objectively I can make the case, and I know that a lot of people say, Balder, that's not objective, that is your subjective bias, but no, I think I can make the objective case that the two clearly undisputable issues that the United States and Europe and elsewhere in the world, but let's stick to the United States. The United States is facing is insane income inequality, which is deeply, deeply threatening the social fabric of the United States and the environment. I mean, people say, "Oh, that's your priorities," but other people have other priorities. No, I think for the survival of the United States, you need to do something about society being ripped apart by money differences, by income differences, and the environment is gonna at some point kill us all if we're not careful. Look at what, just as we're recording, what happened to Texas with at the current count, but it's going to be higher at the end, is 53 people already died because of flooding. So to take away money from those two things, from social welfare and from the environment and from healthcare, three objectively fundamental things for society right now in 2025, and to give them to two things that absolutely are objectively unnecessary: more defense spending, completely insane. The United States doesn't need more defense spending. I've been ranting about how European countries don't need more defense spending. Imagine the United States. And this anti-immigration insanity that we're in, which is also completely counterproductive, is just a sign of how we have completely lost the plot. This is not personal political subjective bias. This is objectively, verifiably insane that we prioritize defense and anti-immigration policies over the environment and social well-being.
Well, let's throw in some facts that I wrote down here. So the Congressional Budget Office estimates that nearly 12 million Americans could lose their health coverage by the end of the next decade, right, as a result of these changes. That is in a country where people are already going into bankruptcy because, I don't know, of a broken arm or some operation they need, right? So an additional 12 million Americans at the risk of that sounds crazy, because that's exactly the problem. I mean, Boulder, I'm going to have to quote Marx here, but I'm only doing this because I'm German, okay? Not because we've established in previous episodes what we think of communism, not a lot.
Don't worry, I've got for the end of the episode, I've got a quote from Lenin. So there we go. We're going to be the red Marxist podcast from now on.
We'll have to, right? But if people have nothing to lose but their own chains, right? That's the moment they will start rising up. I mean, that's the whole basically foundation of society over the last 400 years, is that we gave people something to lose. We elevated to the middle class so that you, me, my neighbors, everyone around me has no interest in revolution. We don't want revolution because it's bad. Revolution is never good. So now if you take healthcare away from people and they might be thrown into bankruptcy, right? Losing their house, living on the streets because of these healthcare bills, it's in your own self-interest to avoid them picking up the pitchforks and coming for your castle.
Completely. And even before the pitchforks, just basic things such as just walking out. And, well, I guess some people don't care about this, but walking out and just seeing the deprivation, seeing the poverty, crime levels potentially going up, death rates going up, putting more strain on the system, right? We know that investing in healthcare is actually a very efficient, effective way to spend your money, because it prevents all kinds of other problems from occurring that cost more money to solve later on. It's like fire prevention is much better than actually putting out a fire, right? That's exactly why healthcare is so important for society. It is just so strange that we are now living in this timeline, in this situation where this can happen, and where nobody apparently has enough influence to say, stop it now, we have to behave responsibly. That kind of lack of serious policy making without any and the lack of political incentives to actually punish those who engage in this unserious policy making means that probably the founding fathers were right, and that the United States after 250 years is bound to die.
Well, let's talk about why it is possible, right, that the United States is bound to die, and that objectively bad things like this can get passed. And so we wrote down here in preparation for the episode that parliamentarians are getting dumber and giving too much power to the executive controlling the legislative.
Yeah, I mean, dumber is maybe not the most sophisticated word. It was for our own notes here.
Balder, I think it's spot on. If I look at some of these people in the House of Representatives, they are objectively getting dumber. For the listeners, they're getting less intelligent.
Well, it's certainly true that over my lifetime, so I started kind of paying a little bit of attention to politics in the late 80s, early 90s as a kid. It is clear that parliamentarians in Europe as well as in the United States have become less likely to be selected based on their intellect, based on their cognitive abilities, and much more on other issues. And those other issues is a combination of how good as a communicator are they, right? How do they connect to voters in meetings, on TV? How likable are they seen? And the other bit that has become particularly pernicious over the past 10, 15 years is how good are they in playing the political game? Are they good foot soldiers within the political establishment, right? Do they do what they're being told? And of course, if you are an intellectual, then often you're not the best communicator. Sometimes you are, but most of the time you think everything is complex and there's a lot of and eyeing and a lot of thinking about what you're going to answer before you answer, which is not what voters want to see. They want decisive, clear, simple answers. And secondly, if you're an intellectual, if you are intelligent, you're gonna have difficulties being part of a political tribe. You're gonna find it difficult to just follow orders from above. You have your own ideas and you want those ideas to be implemented. And so we see this process over the past 30, 40 years of politicians becoming more media savvy and less intellectual, and more loyal to their party and less idealistic with their own ideas put into the mix.
It's particularly that part of becoming more loyal to the party is that parties nowadays have a lot of conformity. And I mean, when I say nowadays, it's not like I know what happened 20, 30 years ago. So I'm sorry to have to bring up my own country again, but we just saw this happening here in the CDU a few months ago, right? Where it was so there was a very important vote for the current chancellor. Well, at that time he wasn't chancellor, and he really needed for it to pass. And within the Conservative Party in Germany, there is so much pressure to have that conformity, right? Because they always want to be seen as the stable factor within the country. They always want to be seen as a stable force. There was so much pressure, right? That typical thing of, hey, if you don't vote with us, the election is in 2 months, we will pull all of our support from you, right? That type of actions, which is really problematic because it leads to a selected few in the party leadership calling the shots, and particularly in the CDU, party leadership and the chancellor is always within the same hands. Right, it has been a thing for 40, 50 years, which is why this is in Germany. This isn't particularly new, but it becomes really problematic because it's basically a one-person party, or more like a 10-person party, because it's the party leadership that calls the shots, and the party leadership kind of holds control over the chancellery. It holds control over kind of the faction within the parliament, over 400,000 members. It's a big problem because it means that more like the more kind of diverse voices get drawn out, and it's really just these 10 people who are kind of part of the same club anyways because they like each other.
For most of my life, exactly because of what you're saying, I've been defending kind of the Anglo-Saxon system in the UK and in the United States, as opposed to continental European politics. In the United Kingdom, there is this never-ending debate about first past the post. You know, the way so people vote for their electorate for a constituency that's sometimes like 40, 50,000 people, many of which don't vote. So it's a relatively small number of direct voters for you as a parliamentarian, and they send you to parliament based on maybe having 20,000 votes, right? Which leads to inherently larger parties having an advantage over smaller parties. And in the British system, just like in the United States, by the way, Elon Musk just started his own political party. Let's see how that goes. It's quite hard if you're not part of the establishment parties to get in. And that is the criticism, that it's very difficult for different voices to be heard. However, what it does do, at least on paper, is avoid the problem you've just described, because it means that parliamentarians, and in Britain this is very clear, are beholden more than anything to their constituents before they're beholden to party leadership, because their constituents have to vote for them again next time. And if they do something that might please the leadership but not their constituents, then they're gonna lose their job, which creates a very healthy friction, kind of tension between party leadership and parliamentarians. And in the United States, in theory, you've got something similar, because they are directly voted in by specific Congress districts or by their states. Unfortunately, in practice, that is no longer working as well, and that's a real shame.
Well, coincidentally, we brought an example from the UK, because Keir Starmer, the current Prime Minister of the UK, just had to learn the hard way what it means to kind of lose one wing of your party because he had to retract a bill he proposed because he couldn't get the socialist wing of his own party, of the Labour Party, to vote with him.
And that should always be celebrated by someone who cares about democracy, right? You don't want, exactly as you just said, you don't want a party leader who's also prime minister to basically control all the dynamics. They still should be negotiating with people around them. They still need to find that balance. A well-functioning democracy is one of small incremental changes, hopefully in the right direction, rather than just a dictatorial figure who for 4 years can do whatever they like. And so whenever there's some kind of revolution, rebellion, let's call it, like we just said, a revolution is not good, rebellion in parliament against leadership, that is a really good sign. Now, people often mock it, right? The Tories, like, oh, they're so vicious and they always go against their own leadership. Yeah, but we should be happy about that. We should be happy about that infighting because it forces leadership to think carefully about what they're doing.
It's not only the Tories, but it's also us. We don't like that because we see a prime minister who doesn't have his party in line as a weak leader and someone that can't represent us on the global stage. And how is he going to pass any policy if he can't even get his own party to agree? We want decisive actions from governments, right? That's all. It's one of those things that we always say. We just need our governments to do something, to change something, and this is where you, the listeners, and us as well, are kind of at fault here because we are rewarding a system in which the legislative is giving more and more power to the executive because it makes their party look good. It makes their party look like they are the ones in charge and they are really bringing the country forward. While we should be kind of celebrating the disagreement within the party, saying that, well, good, because there needs to be this infight, there needs to be different ideas like part of the new proposed legislative.
And that requires a certain sophistication on behalf of the voters that unfortunately is not visible right now, right? If it ever was fully visible, but it requires voters to understand that and not to just be drawn to those superficial kind of images of strong leadership. Now that we're going through European anecdotes. One thing that's always annoyed me about exactly what you're saying is that here in Spain, so Spain is a constitutional monarchy. There's a king, formerly head of state, but has no serious power. And then there's parliament with a prime minister representing the majority in parliament. It's a prime minister. Currently, we have Prime Minister Sanchez in power. But here in Spain, in Spanish, people call him presidente. And what they mean is presidente del gobierno, president of the government. But they keep it short and they say presidente because somehow president sounds more powerful and better than prime minister. Prime minister sounds kind of weak. Sounds kind of like there's someone above you. And technically there is the king. It's technically, not in reality. And every time that someone in Spanish says Presidente Sanchez, I always go Primer Ministro. It's not right to think of Sanchez or any leader, any prime minister as a benign despot. They are simply part of parliament. They literally have a seat in parliament and they are leading a complex, diverse political party, and we should be very happy with that. Unfortunately, in these continental European systems, unlike the Anglo-Saxon world, parliamentarians have always had this tendency of just basically being there, ready to applaud their leader, and not really having much of a voice of their own. If you compare that to British or US politics, it's depressing to see how little influence and how little of a voice your average parliamentarian in Spain or in the Netherlands or in Germany has.
Well, it's a great example of the Western bubble, right? We have the system that that is in theory great, right? And it has always been the foundation of the Western strength, right? So you have, because I really like the parliamentary democracy system, right? That you have a prime minister who is one of the parliamentarians, and he has to be, right? He has to get his or her majority from within parliament, making sure that, okay, I have more than half of parliament behind me, and it usually leads to more like better policy making, because it's not right where it's not like in a presidential system where the president proposes something and then it kind of has parliament pitted against him. No, so in theory, right? It's a better system than it has been in the past because it allows for more legislative oversight, more legislative control. But then because right, we're misunderstanding our strength, and we're seeing all these conflicts within Parliament, and then all these disagreements, and we can't really agree on policy very quickly. Yeah, no shit. Right, that's the whole point of democracy, is that we can't agree on something quickly, and it is all taking a little bit longer because ultimately that leads to better outcomes.
And that connects to what you said before, that voters somehow think that big decisive leadership, like major decisions, is what they want, like a leader who really changes society for the better. But that hardly ever actually works. Like I said before, a well-functioning democracy knows that the power of well-run governments is limited. A well-run government can tweak society a little bit to the left, or a little bit to the right, or a little bit center, or a little bit towards the environment, or a little bit towards defense spending. Once again, public service announcement: if you're living in a NATO member and your government wants to increase defense spending, you're being scammed. Don't let them get away with it, but that by this on the side. But there are small little incremental changes that government, parliament and the government itself can implement. A well-functioning democracy is not a system in which you can have large, radical, sweeping changes very easily. And that's a good thing, because typically if a government can implement large, sweeping changes, that goes against the very fabric of democracy. You need to be limited and kind of modest in your expectations of what a government can do. You've got a state system that makes sure that everything runs well, just civil servants who make sure that, taxes get paid and those taxes get spent on infrastructure and other things that we care about. And then on top of that, you have a government who can slowly over time move it in a certain direction. Rather than this idea that, hey, you feel unhappy with your life, government, if you vote for the right party, then their government is gonna immediately make everything right again. No, that's not how it works.
I don't want our listeners to believe that you are immune to this, because this is one of my favorite polls, and they've been doing it for decades now in Germany, where they ask a set of questions to determine how high your authoritarian tendencies are. And then they also divide it up to along party membership, and of course, no surprise, the right wing idiots are obviously highest up there, right? They love an authoritarian leader, someone who will decisively rule our country and save us from everything and everyone.
Just a clarification, when you say right-wing idiots, you're talking about the AfD and extreme radical right-wing, right? Yeah, just to make sure that people don't think that, because we've already quoted Marx and we're going to quote Lenin later, I don't want people to think that we are on the left and that anyone on the right is an idiot, just to be clear.
No, it's actually interesting that the Conservative Party are they actually reject authoritarian leadership the most, right? Or what was some of the most, right? Which kind of speaks for those conservative values. So no, yeah, I'm of course talking about right extreme wing idiots. Who are very happy in living in an authoritarian system. However, the way the questions are asked, right, they kind of ask about, hey, with this issue, do you think more decisive action is needed, and do you think that maybe centralizing power would actually help this cause? Because the party with the second highest approval kind of for authoritarian measures is the Green Party, and that's something that I think, right, is always the dangerous moment where, I mean, the two of us believe that, hey, we need to seriously address wealth inequality. We need to seriously address environmental issues. But we need to be very careful not to say that, oh, of course, a dictatorship it would be way easier to live in a green dictatorship because then we could really solve the climate crisis, and democracy just isn't effective enough for this.
This was incredibly visible during COVID, of course. That so when you are a Green Party member, you automatically believe in radical changes because there need to, anyone who puts the environment, and myself included there, at the top of the list of priorities, believes that we don't have much time and that we radically need to change things in order to somehow save humanity's future. If you then become part of a party, which I'm not, obviously, then you are okay with that party implementing those radical changes, regardless of whether it respects political boundaries, regardless of whether it respects basic principles of liberal democracy. Because you're saying, look, we're all going to die if we don't do this. So, screw liberal democracy, we need to get this done. You have an inherent bias towards strong government action, as long as it is your kind of government action, right? Not if it's the AFD, not if it's the extreme right, but if your type of policies can get implemented, you will do it. And during COVID, that kind of tendency was very clear. It was the left-wing parties, both the radical left as well as center-left parties, who were most comfortable with implementing incredibly destructive policies in terms of liberal democracy, right? Lockdown, all kinds of executive powers that should never have been given to the government, complete lack of oversight. Basically, hey, people are dying right now, we need to take action. Who cares about certain political principles? We're just gonna save the elderly from dying from COVID, and then afterwards we'll see what the fallout is. Whereas you see the center-right parties and the liberal-right parties being much more skeptical about that, because in their very fabric, in their very foundation, there is this belief that good government requires skepticism about what a government can and cannot do.
This seems like a great moment to end today's conversation on the big beautiful bill and the demise of parliamentary democracy. If you have any questions, comments, or you heard a mistake that we've made throughout the episode, please make sure to send us an email to thewesternbubble@gmail.com. We will try to incorporate them in our following episodes. Thank you very much to the listeners for joining us today. Make sure to join us again next week when we burst the Western Bubble. That is it from my side. Baldur, which closing quote did you pick for us today?
As announced, I chose a quote from Lenin, not knowing that you were going to quote Marx during the episode. Now, I will once again emphasize that Lenin is not for me a historical figure that I look up to in any way. His project has led to countless lives lost and destruction, and the Soviet Union is not an initiative that we would or should want to replicate in the future. So just to get it out there. But just like with Marx, he did understand certain things about dynamics that apparently the economic financial upper classes of today's world have forgotten. And he said, "The oppressed are allowed once every few years to decide which particular representatives of the oppressing class are to represent and repress them in parliament."